Hi everyone, welcome back. I hope you're all doing well. So for today's case, we are covering another very disturbing serial killer that you've probably never heard of. The man that we are talking about today spent years sexually abusing hundreds of teenage boys. He would lure them back to his apartment before he would then pin them down and do unspeakable things to them. But most terrifying of all, the serial killer in today's case got sexually aroused by the thought of biting into young teenage boys' necks. He would sink his teeth into the throats of these young boys, straight into their Adam's apple, before ripping out their windpipes with his teeth. And he had a sick and twisted name for his technique of killing, and that was his love bite. And do you guys remember the case that I covered last Halloween, the case of Peter Curtin, who is known as the Vampire of Dusseldorf? Do you remember Peter Curtin? He would spontaneously climax at pretty much everything, but especially at the sight of blood. Well, today's serial killer has some similarities to Peter Curtin. Yeah. And today we are covering the case of Fritz Haarmann, also known as the Vampire of Hanover, or Wolfman, or the Butcher of Hanover. He has quite a few nicknames. Well, that is the case what we are covering today, so let's jump in. I just want to give a huge thank you to today's sponsor, and that is Dragon City. And this game is my new favorite discovery. Your aim is to become the ultimate Dragon Master, where you build and decorate your dream floating city filled with magical farms, buildings, habitats. The game is full of adventure. There's enchanting quests, ancient legends. You need to breed and hatch your very own cute little baby dragons. Train them, feed them, evolve them, and turn them into impressive beasts to defend you in battle. And this game is just incredible. You guys know how much I love collecting things, and the challenge of collecting all of these dragons is right up my street. There are over 1,000 to collect. They even have designs representing various YouTubers. And also, just look at how cute all of these dragons are. And my favorite right now is the Wind Dragon. I mean, look at how cute. And right now, Dragon City have a ton of Halloween events happening. There's the All Hallows Scream Puzzle Island, the All Hallows Scream Runner Island, and there's also special Halloween dragons to collect. There really isn't a better time to start playing Dragon City than right now in spooky season. And you can download Dragon City by using the link in my description box or by scanning the QR code. Using those links really do help out this channel, and you will get a special bundle with 15,000 food, 30,000 gold, plus the rare zombie flame dragon to get you started with a Halloween treat. So thank you again to Dragon City for sponsoring today's video, but thank you to every single one of you watching right now, because truly without all of you guys, I wouldn't get opportunities like this. And now let's jump into today's case. Fritz Haarmann was born on the 25th of October, 1879. Yes, we are going back to the 1800s for today's case. So that makes Fritz a Scorpio. And he grew up in the city of Hanover, Germany, where he lived with his parents and his 5 older siblings. And growing up, Fritz lived in a very turbulent household. His dad, Ollie, was described as a very aggressive man. He was a strict disciplinarian. He had no time for his kids whatsoever, did not care about them. Literally all he would do was shout at his children. He was barely at home. He always preferred to be out drinking. He has been described as a huge womanizer, and he would cheat repeatedly on his wife, and it is reported that he caught syphilis one time from one of his affairs. Now his wife, Joanna, who is obviously Fritz's mom, she was 7 years her husband's senior. Now she was described as very gentle, very caring, pretty much the complete opposite of the dad. And Joanna came from a very wealthy family, and I read that that is the only reason why Ollie, the dad, married her in the first place, because he was going to get a lot of money out of that marriage. But still, Joanna, she put up with a lot of her husband's nonsense. She stuck around, but she was chronically ill. She couldn't get out of bed most days, and she couldn't see a way out of the relationship. But anyway, when her youngest son, Fritz, was born, and Fritz is obviously who we are talking about today, to distract herself from her husband and just the stress of living with him and raising 4 children, Joanna poured all of her attention into Fritz. He was the light of her life. When Fritz was growing up, he quickly became his mother's favorite child. She pampered him, she adored him, she showed him so much affection. It is said that Joanna, she didn't really care about her other children, really, which is very bad to say, but she didn't care about her two older sons because she has said that they grew up to be too much like their father. One of them had even been sentenced for sexual assault at a very young age. And I don't really know what her thoughts were about her daughters. I just know that she didn't spend much time with her three daughters. And because Joanna didn't have a close relationship with her daughters, this meant that she included Fritz in a lot of her hobbies, her activities that she would have included her daughters in. She dressed Fritz up in girls' clothing, she gave him dolls to play with, she applied makeup to his face, she would place ribbons in his hair. But Fritz has said that he didn't mind this. He preferred these kinds of activities to the more manly activities that young boys were supposed to get involved in. So then Fritz started school and he was described as quite a reserved, quiet child. He didn't really have any friends his own age. He didn't really socialize with any other children apart from his other siblings. He didn't like being placed on the sports teams, like, you know, typical boy things. He preferred to hang out with girls, which meant that Fritz did face a little bit of bullying, a little bit of teasing from the other boys in his school. The teachers didn't really have his back either. They just thought that he was a daydreamer and he needed to man up. So because Fritz needed to man up, he was placed in the care of one of the male teachers at the school. And this male teacher was supposed to show Fritz how to be more manly. But tragically, what ended up happening is that this male teacher actually just started sexually abusing Fritz. And Fritz was only 8 years old at this time, and he was being sexually assaulted regularly by a male teacher, which is just absolutely horrific. And Fritz kept this to himself. He never told a single person about what was going on. And as Fritz started to get older, he started to lash out. He started becoming very disruptive in class. He got suspended multiple times from school. He started to get a thrill out of causing fear in other children. He started to tie his sisters up. He would start to bully his sisters, antagonize them. He would also go around his neighborhood late at night and start banging on the windows and doors to scare the residents of whoever was living in that house. But this wasn't the only thing that started to happen as Fritz grew up, because Fritz started to absolutely despise his father. And it was mutual. His father also despised him. Now, Fritz despised his father because he thought that his father treated his mom badly. But then his father despised Fritz because he thought Fritz was too girly. He wasn't a man. He wasn't gonna grow up into the son that he wanted him to be. Because Fritz, he leaves school at the age of 15 and he immediately enrolls into the military. And it was around this time when Fritz started to explore and discover his sexuality. And he realized he was gay. But again, it is currently in the 1890s at this point. Homosexuality was highly stigmatized and also criminalized back then, which meant that Fritz couldn't be truly open about who he was. And it had a huge impact on him. But not just that, 5 months into his military training, Fritz fell seriously ill. He started collapsing all of the time. He was passing out. He was going weak, dizzy. And at first, the doctors had no idea what was going on with him. And he was diagnosed with a few different conditions before doctors actually diagnosed him with epilepsy. Fritz actually did see a number of doctors and psychiatrists throughout this case, and he was diagnosed with so many things. At one point, he was even diagnosed with schizophrenia, but because he was diagnosed with epilepsy, he was kicked out of the military, and Fritz was distraught about this because now he returns home and he has nothing to do and he needs a job, he needs money, which meant that he was forced to work in his dad's factory instead. Now, we know how turbulent their relationship is. Fritz and his dad, they basically hate each other. So the idea that Fritz had to work with his dad was a living nightmare. He was lashing out, misbehaving, but this is also when a darker side of Fritz started to emerge, because this was the moment when Fritz started to sexually abuse young boys. His sexual urges were spiraling out of control, and Fritz kept noticing young boys walking around the neighborhood, and he would start to think about doing doing despicable things to these young boys. So Fritz started to hang around late at night in his neighborhood. He would lurk in secluded areas like down alleyways, for example, and he would just wait for a young boy to pass him. He would make sure that these young boys, they were on their own, their parents weren't in sight or anything like that. Then he would lure these young boys to another secluded area. He liked to take young boys to cellars before molesting and sexually assaulting these young boys. And he did this repeatedly. It's not actually known how many victims Fritz had at this point. He was sexually assaulting so many young boys, and I'm talking children. I'm talking like under the ages of 10, some of these children. But these young boys, they were too scared to report Fritz. They were too scared to say anything, even to their parents, to anyone. Because number one, they didn't think that anyone would believe them. But number two, it was taboo to talk about anything related to sex. So these young boys, they never told anybody. Until one of the victims did report the assault to their mother. The mother then reported the assault of her son to the police. Fritz was then arrested and thrown in jail. But the police, they weren't really too concerned. Fritz only served a very short sentence in prison and then he was released. And then Fritz just went back to his daily routine of sexually abusing young boys because no one seemed to care. So now possibly hundreds of more young boys were now victims of Fritz. 6 months later, Fritz was actually arrested again, but this time he wasn't thrown in jail. He was actually placed in a mental health facility. And once Fritz arrived at this mental health facility, he did not have a very good time at all. Again, he was evaluated by psychiatrists and he was deemed, quote, incurably deranged. And back in the late 1800s in mental institutions in Germany, if someone was deemed deranged or incurably deranged, they were basically thrown in a room, locked up, and the key was thrown away because it was thought that you can't help them. So what's the point? What's the point of even treating them like a human being? But what is just absolutely crazy is that after spending 7 months in the mental health facility, Fritz managed to escape, which I'm like, what? He managed to escape and he fled to Switzerland. It is not known if he was assisted in any way, but I assume he was. But he made it all the way to Switzerland and his mom started to send him money to Switzerland so he could hide out in Switzerland. And Fritz spent 16 months in Switzerland evading capture. No one even came looking for him. No one seemed to even care. So now Fritz is 19 years old and he finally returns back to Germany. He uses a fake name. And when he returns to Germany, this is when his mom really wanted Fritz to find himself a girlfriend because she thought that a man of his age, he needs a girlfriend, he needs to settle down, get married and start to have children. So this is when Fritz's mom set him up with a neighbor's daughter called Anna, and then this is pretty much what happened. They started dating and Fritz settled down with Anna, got engaged, and it wasn't long until she was pregnant with their first child. So Fritz, along with his fiancée, they decide to open up their own fishmongers. And Fritz was loving life as a fishmonger. He spent a lot of time gutting and filleting and selling fish, skills that he would later need, unfortunately. So currently everything is going great for Fritz. Anna had just fallen pregnant with their second child, but that would not last for long because Anna had decided that she had had enough. She didn't want to be with Fritz anymore. She just didn't like him. So she calls off the engagement. And because the fishmonger business was in her name, she also took the business from Fritz. She also took their home and the 2 children, leaving Fritz with nothing. And I can't say for sure, but I don't think Fritz ever sees his children again. And that's probably for the best. So Fritz's life right now really is completely falling apart. He now has absolutely nothing. He has no job, no money, no fiance, no home. So what does Fritz decide to do? He decides to turn to a life of crime. I mean, he's already a criminal. He's already a paedophile. Let's not forget that. And he was still sexually assaulting boys, by the way, the whole time. Just because I haven't been saying, it did not stop. And it's like, remember, he has his own children at this point as well. So God knows what he possibly could have done to them. But this is when Fritz becomes deeply entrenched in the German criminal underground. He started to make a lot of dodgy connections. He started committing petty theft, burglaries. He also spent some time as a con artist. He set up multiple fraudulent businesses where he would essentially just con people out of their money. Around this time as well, Fritz was in and out of jail on various different offences, such as assault, larceny, embezzlement. And then to top things off, Fritz also became a professional grave robber. And this is now Fritz's life, full of criminal activity. And now we get to Fritz in his 30s. This is when his sexual assault of young boys just continues to get worse and worse. It is now escalating because he is not only sexually assaulting young boys on the streets, he is now also luring them back to his apartment. He would always choose vulnerable young boys, runaways, or young boys that were homeless that did need a hot meal. And he would bring them into his apartment and he would give them a warm meal. And then he would sexually assault these young boys over and over again. And he would sometimes keep these young boys in his apartment for days at a time before then letting them go. And then these young boys were so scared to ever report anything about Fritz. But Fritz was now also expanding his range and his type of victims. He wasn't only targeting young boys anymore. It was then teenage boys and older teenage boys, but also male sex workers. And then just another crazy turn of events for this case. Fritz randomly becomes a police informant. All of a sudden, Fritz became very chummy with the local police department. He started telling police officers that he could help them out and catch the bad guys, give them information. And the time period that we are in right now, it is just after World War I. The police departments in the whole of Germany were in a terrible state. The country was in a lot of debt. They had pretty much no resources, and the police departments especially were desperate for any kind of help. And Fritz thought to himself, I am deeply entrenched in the criminal underground. I have a lot of information on a lot of dodgy people. I can work as a police informant, earn myself some money, become good friends with police officers, then they would trust Fritz, and then Fritz would be able to get away with his own criminal activity right under police officers' noses because they would never suspect Fritz. And it was kind of a genius plan because it worked. This is very important to today's case, the fact that Fritz became a police informant. This is essentially how he was able to get away with all of his crimes, especially the murders, for so long. But then all of this power, it really did go to Fritz's head because he started making citizens arrests himself. He started going around the neighborhood, around train stations, started thinking that he could lay down the law himself. And he had the police wrapped around his little finger. And Fritz was loving life. He was confident. He was so emboldened by all of this. He thought there is no way the police are ever going to suspect me of committing all of these atrocious crimes when I'm their best informant. He thought that he could get away with any crime that he wanted. So now his crimes become even worse. Now Fritz realized that he had other sexual urges and desires when he had these young boys and young men in his control. He realized that he had a strong sexual desire to bite down on these young boys' necks. I am not talking about playful biting, non-aggressive biting. I'm not talking about that. Fritz wanted to sink his teeth into their necks. He wanted to pierce skin. He wanted to see blood. And these were not just thoughts and fantasies in Fritz's mind, because he actually wanted to carry these out. And this is now when the deadly killing spree of Fritz Hamann begins. Because in September of 1918, 38-year-old Fritz went looking for a victim, a young boy like he always did. And this is when he came across a 17-year-old boy called Friedel. He spotted Friedel in a nearby cafe and Fritz went in, he sat by the boy, started up a conversation. Now Friedel told Fritz that he was a runaway and Fritz was like, great, this is my perfect victim. Fritz told Friedel that that he was a police officer and that he could look out for him. This was a tactic that Fritz used all of the time. He would tell his victims that he was a police officer, someone that they could trust, rely on. And the two of them went back to Fritz's apartment. They both smoked for a little bit, they had conversation, but this time Fritz was losing control and he was becoming more and more aggressive. He started touching Friedel inappropriately without his consent, and when Friedel tried to push Fritz off of him, this is when Fritz grabbed his throat, pinned him down and started to rape him. And as Fritz was carrying out this sexual assault, this is when he got the desire to bite into Friedel's throat. And Fritz has had this urge for a while, and up until this point he's been able to restrain himself, but no longer. So Fritz bared his teeth, bit down on Friedel's throat, right into his Adam's apple. And Friedel's neck started pouring with blood. He was gasping for air. He must have been in so much pain. I can't even imagine. And Fritz became instantly aroused by the blood, what he had done. So Fritz just kept biting down onto Friedel's throat. He also then started to drink the blood from Friedel's neck, and this aroused him even more, until eventually Fritz sunk his teeth into Friedel's windpipe, got a good grip of it, before ripping it clean out with his teeth. I can't even wrap my head around how anyone can do that, but oh my god, to murder somebody by biting into their neck and ripping out their windpipe with their teeth is absolutely horrifying. That poor boy. And this is the moment when 17-year-old Friedel lost his life. And that is just an awful, awful way to go. And then after the murder, Fritz got straight to work. He was not messing around at all. He pulled out a load of knives and he started dismembering Friedel's body. He also decapitated him and stored various body parts around his home. And then over the next few days, Fritz would place various body parts in a suitcase and walk to the local cemetery and bury the body parts in the cemetery. Now, it wasn't too long until Friedel's friends reported him missing to the police. They told the police that Friedel had been hanging around with a strange police officer, and they were able to give the police Fritz's home address. So police officers turned up at Fritz's apartment to search the place for Friedel. And this is where this case should end, because there are still body parts in Fritz's apartment. The decapitated head of Friedel is still in the apartment. Fritz has actually hidden the decapitated head in the oven behind newspapers. So he hasn't really hidden it that well. So police officers should be able to find the head of Friedel, and that is where this case should end. But unbelievably, when the police turned up at Fritz's apartment, they barged in and Fritz was currently sexually assaulting another 13-year-old boy, which is possibly a potential murder victim to Fritz. So the police arrest Fritz for the sexual assault of the 13-year-old boy. They took him down to the station, and again, I just feel like case closed. The police have arrested Fritz, yes, on a different assault, but still they've arrested him. This is grounds to search his apartment, and therefore they will find the decapitated head. But they don't. The police search the apartment, but they don't exactly do a thorough job, and they completely miss the decapitated head of Friedel in the oven. So therefore, the police did not charge Fritz with the murder of Friedel. Friedel was still just a missing boy. Instead, he was charged with assault and battery of a minor for the 13-year-old boy, and he was sent to prison for only 9 months. So that was Fritz's first murder. Now, something very significant happens after this first murder, because just after Fritz gets out of prison after serving 9 months for sexual assault and battery, he meets a young man called Hans Granz. And Hans would soon become Fritz's accomplice / sidekick. Now, Hans was 18 years old. He was a runaway. And to be honest, Hans is literally the perfect victim for Fritz. He was a runaway. He'd had an argument with his dad, so no one was going to come looking for him. He was currently homeless and he was working as a sex worker. Now, Hans became aware of Fritz because Fritz frequently visited sex workers. So Hans was the one to introduce himself to Fritz to solicit business. And one thing led to another, and the two of them became best friends. Now, I can't help but wonder if Hans was a potential victim when they first met, because I'm convinced that he was. Like I've said, he was literally the perfect victim for Fritz. But Fritz became almost obsessed with Hans. They formed quite a close bond. Fritz would invite Hans over to his apartment all of the time. They became the best of friends. Then apparently they became lovers, even though Hans has said himself that he was straight. So again, I'm not quite sure about this relationship. I don't know the ins and outs and the details. Was Fritz just paying Hans as a client of his? Who knows? But Fritz also invited Hans to live in his apartment. And over time, Fritz actually said that Hans became almost like a son to him, which makes me feel very sick, because one minute they're lovers and then the next moment you're seeing this 18-year-old boy as your son. It's messed up. But Fritz apparently well and truly fell in love with Hans. He felt a duty of care to protect him, look after him. And they had a very turbulent relationship. Neighbours would say that they would hear shouting, arguments, fights all of the time. They would also see Hans storm out of the apartment, but he would always return. So then 4 years pass. Fritz goes in and out of prison on various different offences, and he remains in this somewhat of a relationship with Hans the entire time. And as far as we are aware, during those 4 years, Fritz did not murder anyone. At least it hasn't been confirmed. So I wouldn't be surprised if he did. There has just been no confirmed murder victims in that time. But now we get to February of 1923, and his murderous ways make a comeback, and it's even worse than before. Because one day, Fritz goes out onto the streets prowling for a victim. Again, this is very normal behavior for Fritz. But this is when Fritz came across a 17-year-old boy called Fritz Frank. He invited the 17-year-old boy back to his apartment. Now, back at the apartment, this is obviously where Hans lives. And Hans was in the apartment with 2 female acquaintances. And apparently one of these female acquaintances was Hans' lover. And it's just all very complicated. It just seems like everyone is having sex with everyone, if I'm being completely honest. But this is when Hans starts to become involved in the murders. So anyway, Fritz returns to the apartment with this 17-year-old boy, Fritz Frank, and the group are chatting, they are having a few drinks, and this is when Hans says to one of his female acquaintances, he's going to be trampled on today, meaning the 17-year-old boy. Now, the woman had no idea what Hans meant by this, but not too long after, Hans and the 2 women leave the apartment, leaving Fritz alone with 17-year-old Fritz Frank. Fritz now being alone with his victim, it wasn't long until he started sexually assaulting him. And then it wasn't too long until he bit into the 17-year-old's throat, and he kept biting until he saw blood. He drank blood, and then he kept biting until he pulled out the windpipe with his teeth, taking 17-year-old Fritz Frank's life. And it's just so awful. Like, what is wrong with this man? Like, why is he biting the windpipes out of young boys? And later on, the same evening, Hans returns to the apartment, finding Fritz with the naked, bloody corpse of the 17-year-old boy on a bed. And it is clear that this young boy has obviously been murdered. And this is when Hans looks at Fritz and just very calmly says, "When should I come back again?" Before calmly turning around, leaving the apartment and leaving Fritz to do whatever he wants to do to this 17-year-old boy's corpse. And I'm like, what the actual hell? He is not fazed at all. He literally just said, "When should I come back? When will you be finished?" Basically. So Hans hasn't murdered this young boy himself, but he's clearly okay with it. It's almost like he was just pretending that he never even saw the dead body of this boy. So then the next day, Hans and the 2 women that he was with the previous day, they all return to the apartment. Now, the 2 women, one of them notices the young boy's clothes on the bed, but the boy is nowhere to be seen. They ask Fritz, what happened to the boy? Like, where is he? His clothes are here, but he's not here. And this is when Fritz angrily replied, "Oh, he left. He's gone traveling. He's gone back to Hamburg." But the women didn't believe him. And after they left the apartment, they went straight to the police. And again, I'm like, this is the second murder now. This again should be case closed. But unfortunately, when the women went to the police station, they spoke to a detective. And the detective that they spoke to was friends with Fritz. He was one of the detectives that Fritz was working for as an informant. So the detective took down the notes that the women told him. He ordered a search of Fritz's apartment. He went through the motions of what he was supposed to do as a police officer. However, he didn't actually want to find anything incriminating because Fritz was too valuable as an informant. So in the end, the detective said that there was no evidence found in the apartment, which there more than likely was, and then the investigation was closed. And this is what I mean when I said that Fritz had the police department in his area wrapped around his little finger, because he truly does. So because he now is so confident that he's just going to get away with murder, this is when he launches into a relentless and brutal killing spree. And I truly mean that, because just 5 weeks later, on the 20th of March, Fritz finds another 17-year-old victim called Wilhelm. He found Wilhelm at a train station and he was a runaway. And this is when he follows the same playbook that he always does. He introduced himself as a police officer, someone that he could trust. He invited Wilhelm back to his apartment for a hot meal, a place to sleep for the night. But as soon as they got back to the apartment, this is sadly when Fritz started to sexually assault the young boy. And then it wasn't long until he sunk his teeth into his neck. He became incredibly aroused and he kept biting down until he reached the windpipe, and Wilhelm sadly lost his life. And afterwards, Fritz dismembered the body and dumped the body parts in a nearby river. And unfortunately, no one came looking for the 17-year-old boy. And then just a couple of months later, Fritz committed 2 more murders in the exact same way. The first victim was a 16-year-old boy called Roman, and then the second victim was a 19-year-old boy called Hans. They were both murdered after being sexually assaulted, and Fritz bit down into their neck until their windpipe. Now, Fritz has a very specific MO. He follows the same pattern for every single murder, down to a T. His victims were pretty much always boys in their teenage years to late teenage years. He always targeted boys that were vulnerable in some sort of way because of their social circumstances. Most of them were homeless or runaways. His favorite place to search for victims was actually train stations, and he would always introduce himself to these boys as a police officer, someone that they could trust, and he would lure them back to his apartment on the promise of a hot meal and a bed to stay in. And to these vulnerable young boys that were homeless or a runaway, the idea of a warm meal and a roof over their head for at least one night was very appealing. Now, how long he kept the boys at his apartment did vary. Some boys, he took them back to his apartment and he murdered them straight away. But then some boys he did keep around for a few days. He let them carry out these odd jobs that he had. It's almost like he was using them for child labor before he murdered them. But then when he did murder these young boys, he would always do it in the same way. He would always hold them down, sexually assault them, rape them, violently bite down on their neck. Their blood would pour everywhere. He would drink blood from their necks. He would become very sexually aroused by the whole thing, and he would keep biting down on their necks until he found the windpipe, and then he would rip the windpipe out of their neck with his teeth. And he did this until they died of asphyxiation. And Fritz came up with a little name for his method of killing. He called it his love bite. And then after his 2 most recent victims, this is when Fritz came up with a new process on how he was going to get rid of the victims' bodies, which is just absolutely sickening. Because the first thing that Fritz would do was pour himself a mug of black coffee to prepare himself for what he was about to do. And then he would lay the body on the floor. He would place a cloth over the face because he didn't want to look at the face of the victim that he had just murdered. He clearly wants to dissociate himself from what he has just done, before taking a knife and making 2 large cuts into the stomach area. This is when he would use his bare hands to scoop out the intestines and place them in a bucket. He would then grab a towel and shove it into the hole that he had made into the stomach where the intestines were, and he would try and soak up all of the blood. He would then make 3 cuts between the victim's shoulders and ribs, and then he would push down as hard as he could until the ribs snapped clean from the shoulder joints. This meant that Fritz had easy access to all of the internal organs, and he would take his time getting his hands in there and removing all of the internal organs. He would remove the heart, the lungs, the kidneys, and he would chop them all up and then place them in the same bucket as the intestines, before then severing the arms and legs from the torso, which then he would meticulously strip the flesh from the bones until the bones were completely clean. This is why I said his time as a fishmonger and him gutting fish and everything would have helped him with his crimes. And then he was just shoveling all of these bits of flesh into wax cloth bags. And the sight, the smell, everything must have been awful. And Fritz ended up flushing down the toilet a lot of the flesh and the organs, and then he dumped some of the other flesh and organs, and just what he couldn't get down the toilet he would dump in the nearby river. And Fritz has actually said himself that he hated this process, but his passion for murder outweighed his distaste for dismemberment. And then the final part of dismembering the body, and the most time-consuming, was decapitating the head. And once he had done this, Fritz would use a small knife to strip all of the flesh from the skull and flush the flesh down the toilet. He would then take the skull, wrap it in rags, place it downwards on a pile of straw before taking an axe and smashing the skull into small pieces. He would then take out the brain, chop up the brain and place it in the same bucket with the rest of the organs and the intestines. And in the dead of night, he would just carry this bucket of organs down to his nearby river and just dump them into the river. And organs would literally just be floating down the river, just like there for anyone to see. He would also dispose of the bones in the river as well on separate occasions. And Fritz felt like he had this process down, the whole murder, the dismemberment, everything. It was just routine for him and he was getting away with it. So now the murder's just going to overdrive. On the 9th of June, Fritz and Hans actually move into a new apartment, and just 2 weeks later, their 13-year-old neighbour goes missing, who was a young boy. And of course, Fritz abducted and murdered this 13-year-old neighbour. And I just want to pause for a second there, because that is how confident Fritz is that he's going to get away with murder. This is possibly the only murder victim of Fritz that wasn't vulnerable. This young boy, he had a family, he had a roof over his head, wasn't homeless, wasn't a runaway, had people to report him missing, and he's a neighbour, so could easily be linked back to Fritz. But Fritz just got away with murder again. And with the murder of his neighbour, this is when Fritz actually starts to keep trophies from his victims. He kept the boy's skull cap and braces in his apartment. 2 months later, 18-year-old Heinrich went missing. He was last seen in the cinema by his aunt. And once again, this was the work of Fritz. Then just 1 month later, 17-year-old Paul went missing whilst he was travelling through Hanover. Again, he was a victim of Fritz. Fritz has now murdered 8 young boys and men, 7 of which have been in the last 6 months. And the police are not doing a single thing. And it's so frustrating, because Fritz has been linked to the missing boys, especially of the first 2. But the police are doing absolutely nothing to find all of these missing boys. Because in 1923, which is the year we're currently at in this case, in Hanover alone, 600 teenage boys were reported missing. So it was pretty much an epidemic of missing teenage boys. So this was a perfect cover for Fritz, because it seems like Fritz wasn't the only predator on the streets of Hanover at this time. Combined with the fact that Fritz is also friends with the police, and the police don't want to investigate Fritz either because he's just too much of a good informant, Fritz felt like he was going to be able to get away with these murders for forever. On the 30th of September, Fritz lured a 17-year-old boy called Richard to his apartment under the pretenses that Fritz had a job for Richard. But once again, Fritz had found another victim. Fritz sexually assaulted him, bit into his neck until he reached his windpipe, and took the life of 17-year-old Richard. On the 12th of October, Fritz found another victim, 16-year-old Wilhelm. He took the 16-year-old boy back to his apartment and did the same thing, sexually assaulted the young boy and murdered him. Just 2 weeks later, Fritz took the lives of 2 young boys in the space of 3 days. This was a 15-year-old boy called Harmon and a 13-year-old boy called Heinz. These murders are escalating. The cool down period between the murders is getting shorter and shorter. And Fritz, his confidence was going through the roof, because now he was also looking to profit from the murders. So he would strip the boys clean of all of their clothes, their shoes, belts, anything that they had on them, and then he would start to sell the possessions of his victims to the highest bidder. He even gave the stolen bicycle from one of his victims to his lover, Hans, who then sold the bike and made a profit from it. Hans, I know I haven't mentioned him in a while, Hans the lover, the sidekick, but he just doesn't care. He seems to be aware of everything and he just doesn't care as long as he profits in some sort of way from these murders. So as far as we're aware, Hans didn't himself participate in the murders, but he's just as complicit because he's just standing by letting Fritz get away with it. But if you think things in this case have been disturbing, wait until you hear what happens next. So Fritz goes on another killing spree, killing 6 young boys who were 17-year-old Adolf, 17-year-old Ernest, 19-year-old Adolf, 20-year-old Heinrich, 19-year-old Willy, and 16-year-old Hermann, killing them all in the exact same way as his other victims. And as all of these murders were happening, neighbours were starting to notice some strange activity going on in Fritz's apartment. Because Fritz, all of a sudden, out of the blue, becomes an underground meat dealer. Yeah, I'm not joking. We all know where this is going. So at this point, we are still just after World War I. Poverty was rife in Germany. People were willing to do pretty much anything to save money on especially food, and people needed to eat. So illegal meat sellers especially started to pop up all over the place. And Fritz joined in on this trend. He would sell sausages to neighbours. He would sell mincemeat to neighbours. Everything was always ground into very small, fine pieces. It was always completely boneless. And neighbours started to become very sick from eating this meat. One neighbour became violently sick after they ate what they thought were sheep's intestines. Another neighbour became sick after they ate meat that Fritz claimed was horse meat. And neighbours would quite often see Fritz leaving his home with packages of meat, but they never saw him bringing the meat into his apartment. So where was this meat coming from? And as you have probably already guessed, it is now widely believed that the meat that Fritz was selling had come from the human remains from his victims. Yeah. Fritz is now selling human meat to his neighbours and people in his local area. And it didn't go unnoticed. People reported this dodgy meat to police. There was even a time when 2 female friends of Hans, remember Hans, he's still there living in the apartment, 2 female friends of his came to visit him in the apartment, and apparently they saw a pot on a stove that contained a human mouth boiling inside of the pot. And I'm like, what? A human mouth? Like, I'm struggling to even picture that right now. Are they talking about like just the lower part of the jaw? Are they talking about the lips? I don't know. All I know is that they saw a human mouth boiling in this pot on the stove. The 2 women removed the mouth from the pot and took it straight to the police station. But the police took one look at this human mouth and said that it looked like a pig snout. But again, it just seems like anything that is connected to Fritz, the police don't want to touch because they don't want to find anything incriminating because Fritz is too valuable for them. So Fritz just carries on getting away with murder, as well as possibly selling human meat to unsuspecting victims. And the murders just continue. It's absolutely ridiculous. Fritz has already murdered 18 young boys and men. But now, over the space of the next 5 weeks, Fritz goes on to murder 5 more young boys and men. There was 22-year-old Hermann, 16-year-old Alfred, 16-year-old Wilhelm, 18-year-old Robert, and 14-year-old Heinz. But this killing spree, Fritz starts to get a little bit sloppy, and he starts to become quite attached to the young boys and men that he is murdering. It's almost like he is starting to get a guilty conscience. He now started to keep the young boys around for longer in his apartment before he murdered them. It's almost like he wanted to form more of a connection, more of a relationship with these boys. But Fritz was starting to feel incredibly guilty about what he was doing. And I'm just like, well, if you feel that guilty, stop. But he doesn't. Instead, he carries on murdering young boys and men. And after the murders, he actually just starts to cry. he actually collapses onto the victims, puts a cloth over their face so he doesn't have to see them, and he just bursts out crying. At this point, Fritz had realized that he was killing purely for sexual thrill. He got such arousal out of the sexual assault, but especially out of biting the boys' necks and seeing the blood. And it was just too strong. His impulse to do this, he could not stop it. And then after the murder, Fritz has apparently said that he was disgusted in himself. And you might be thinking, is this case ever going to end? Like, is he ever going to get caught? Because right now, Fritz has murdered 22 young boys and men in the space of a year, and he has murdered 23 overall. But now it turns out that the police are finally going to catch up to him. Finally. Because on the 17th of May, 1924, two children were out playing by a river that Fritz dumped a lot of the body parts and the bones in. And this is when the two children came across a human skull. It was taken straight to the police for them to investigate. But as soon as the police saw the human skull, they thought to themselves, it's probably nothing. It's probably just medical students dumping organs and body parts in the river, because that's totally normal. I mean, it probably was for back then, but still, they are not doing anything. A literal human skull has been handed in and they just don't care. And then just 1 week later, Fritz goes on to murder 2 more young boys, which could have been prevented if the police had just done their job. The first of these 2 victims was a 10-year-old boy called Friedrich, and this was the youngest victim that Fritz had. And then the second victim, Fritz murdered on the very same day. So he really is escalating at this point. And this was a 16-year-old boy who was also named Friedrich. It is just so unbelievable, so tragic. All of these young boys have been murdered and it just seems like no one cares. And at this point, the locals were completely fed up. They were fed up of boys going missing. They were fed up of the police not doing anything. So the local residents decided to take matters into their own hands. And they went on a search of the local river on their own accord just to see what they could find. And after wading through the water and digging through the riverbeds, this is when they came across hundreds of different pieces of human remains. They found so many bones. And thank God the police could not ignore this situation any longer. So the police sent a specialist team to search the river themselves. And this is when they found a further 500 human bones and human pieces of flesh and organs. And this was later confirmed by a doctor to be at least 22 individuals. So the police finally realized that they had a serial killer on their hands, and they set out to find the serial killer as soon as possible. But unfortunately, Fritz had one final victim, who was a 17-year-old boy called Eric. Eric told his parents that he was going for a swim in the nearby river, and he was traveling the streets alone when he was picked up by Fritz. He was lured back to the apartment, sexually assaulted, whilst Fritz bit into his neck and tore into his windpipe, instantly taking Eric's life. He then dismembered Eric's body and disposed of the pieces. And just a few days later, thankfully and finally, the police were about to catch up to Fritz. Because for over a year now, there have been a lot of suspicions around Fritz and his behaviour and his apartment, and neighbours noticed that there was always young boys going into his apartment, let alone the fact that Fritz always seemed to have meat coming out of his apartment. And neighbours just realised that no one ever seemed to leave that apartment. They saw boys going in, but they never saw them coming out. So when the police realised that there was a serial killer on the loose, people's suspicions instantly turned onto Fritz. So police decided to put Fritz under surveillance. They were finally doing their job. So on the night of the 22nd of June 1924, undercover officers followed Fritz, and they watched Fritz leave his apartment and make his way over to Hanover train station, and he seemed to be accompanied by a young boy, possibly another victim. And once Fritz was at the train station, the officers saw Fritz eyeing up all of the young boys getting off of the trains. He was basically searching for another victim, before undercover officers witnessed 44-year-old Fritz get into an argument with the young boy he was with, who was 15-year-old Carl, and Fritz had the nerve to approach other police officers that were at the train station. So not the undercover police officers, other police officers at the train station. And Fritz told these police officers that this 15-year-old boy was using fake documents and that they should arrest him, which was a load of lies, complete BS. Instead, Carl told the police officers that Fritz had actually been holding holding him captive for 4 days and raped him repeatedly with a knife to his throat. And the police officers listening to this 15-year-old boy tell them this were astounded. But the undercover police officers were also listening. And this is when they swooped in and finally arrested Fritz Harman. Finally, it's about goddamn time. Now, at this point, everything moves incredibly quickly. Fritz's apartment was searched, and they found that pretty much everywhere, the walls, the floors, the bedding, everything was covered in blood. They questioned the neighbours, and the neighbours said how frequently young boys would go into the apartment and never come out. They also reiterated all of the dodgy meat activity. And also when searching the apartment, this is when the police found a load of possessions that belonged to the victims. So clothing, belts, shoes, everything. And police took all of these possessions and displayed them in the local police station and said to the public, if you are a parent of a missing child, come down to see if any of these possessions belong to your child. And this is how the police tried to identify who the victims of Fritz were. And by using the clothing and the possessions of the victims, the police were able to identify 27 victims. So 27 young men, teenagers and boys. And as you can imagine, the parents were absolutely devastated that their sons had been taken in such a brutal, sadistic way. And as for Fritz, at first he tried to deny everything, but given the sheer amount of evidence that was against him, he soon confessed to everything. He confessed to all of the sexual assaults, the murders, how he disposed of their body parts. And when Fritz was describing the murders, he said that it was just rabid sexual passion, that he couldn't help himself. And he also said, quote, I never intended to hurt those young boys, but I knew that if I got going, something would happen. And so I would throw myself on top of those boys, bite through their Adam's apple, and throttle them at the same time. So according to Fritz, he never actually intended to murder anybody, but he would be seized by, quote, an irresistible urge to bite into their windpipe whilst in the throes of ecstasy. And when Fritz was asked how many victims he had, how many murder victims he had, he simply responded, I don't know, maybe between 50 and 70. You heard that right, between 50 and 70, which is way more victims than the police thought. But in the end, the police only found evidence and the possessions to 27 victims. So that is all that Fritz was charged with. But given the fact that most of his murders happened in 1923 to 1924, given the time period that we are in, I think it would be very easy for Fritz to have had a lot more victims. So I don't know if I believe him where he says between 50 and 70, because that does seem like a lot. I personally do believe that the number is higher than 27. And a few months later, in December of 1924, Fritz finally went to trial, and it took Germany by storm. It is said that the trial was one of the first modern media events in Germany. It also received extensive international press coverage, being described as the most revolting criminal case in German history. This is when Fritz was also given a variety of nicknames such as the Vampire of Hanover and Wolfman and the Butcher of Hanover. So the trial began, and guess who made a guest appearance in the dock alongside Fritz? His little sidekick, Hans Granz. And this added an extra layer of intrigue to the trial because everyone was like, oh my God, who is this other man? This man that is apparently Fritz's lover slash sidekick. People were wondering how much involvement did Hans have. And Hans was charged as being an accessory to the murders. And during the trial, it appeared that Fritz loved the whole thing. First of all, he was his own defense. He didn't have lawyers. No. He wanted the spotlight for himself. He wanted to defend himself. And he basically used that courtroom as a performance. He loved playing this role. He loved shocking the jury and everyone in the courtroom. He had a smile on his face the whole time. And he was even laughing and joking with the jury, with others in the courtroom. There was a few occasions where the whole courtroom burst into laughter because Fritz was just so goddamn funny. And it's like, people, he's on trial for 27 murders. There is nothing funny about him. And unbelievably, the jury actually warmed to his character. They thought that he was warm and likable and trustworthy. And I'm like, Trustworthy. A murderer, a serial killer is trustworthy. Those two words should not be in the same sentence. But there was one thing that really annoyed Fritz during the trial, and that was that there was too many women in the courtroom. He even asked the judge to remove the women from the courtroom. And the judge promptly said, "Sorry, I have no control over them," which I just thought was very funny. At one point as well, Fritz said that he was incredibly bored and he asked for a cigar, which he was promptly given. I'm like, no. Why are we treating him like this? He is a serial killer. You do not give him a cigar. Throughout the trial, Fritz went into unnecessarily graphic detail about all of the murders, which it's just plain and clear that he was loving it and he was reliving the murders as he was telling them. And he was probably getting off on the shock and disgust of the jury and the others in the courtroom. He was probably also getting sexually aroused as he was describing his sexual assaults and biting into Adam's apples and drinking blood. He also went into a lot of detail about the dismembering, which was apparently his least favourite part of the murders, but he's definitely not acting like it. However, Fritz also denied some of the murders that he was being charged with. He also denied selling human meat, which again, the truth over this whole dodgy meat situation is still unknown to this very day. I mean, was it animals or was it human? We just don't know. And the jury thought that because Fritz was so forthcoming about everything and they trusted him when he said that he didn't murder some of the victims. He's just manipulating everyone into doing what he wants. And there was one other notable thing from the trial, and that is that Fritz completely turned on his sidekick Hans, who he was apparently in love with. He started spewing false accusations about Hans, making up lies that Hans himself had committed some of the murders, even though that was not the truth. Hans is guilty, don't get me wrong. He is complicit in most, if not all, of these murders. However, he never committed the murders himself. But because the jury trusted Fritz, they believed him. And also Hans, he was a different kind of character to Fritz in the trial. Hans was very quiet, he was very reserved, he didn't really show much emotion, and he wasn't very likable. So the jury thought that he was more dangerous, more quiet in comparison to the likable, charming Fritz. Fritz also told the jury that it was Hans' fault for all of the murders. He told the jury, quote, "Hans could have saved me, but he chose not to." And Fritz and Hans would get into huge public arguments during the trial, which only made the case worse for Hans. And by the end of the trial, Fritz Hamann was found guilty of 24 out of the 27 murders. He was found not guilty on the other 3 due to technicalities, although it is still widely believed that he did commit these murders, if not many more that he wasn't even charged with. And his accomplice, Hans Granz, was found guilty of being an accessory to many of the murders. But on top of this, because of all of Fritz's lies about Hans, he was also found guilty for one victim for incitement of murder, which carried a much heavier sentence. So because of this, both Fritz Hamann and Hans Granz were both sentenced to death. And this is the outcome that Fritz was expecting. He actually stood up on the dock and loudly shouted, "I accept this verdict fully and freely. I shall go to the decapitating block joyfully and happily." And Hans just completely broke down. He was hysterical. And he's definitely guilty. I'm not saying that, but he has been sentenced to death for crimes that he didn't commit. And then just 4 months later, at 6 o'clock in the morning on the 15th of April 1925, Fritz Hamann was executed first. He was led to the guillotine. He was asked if he had any last wishes, where he said that he wanted an expensive cigar and a Brazilian coffee, which he was given both, and then he was beheaded. But now this is where this case has one final twist, because shortly after Fritz's execution, a member of the public found a letter written by Fritz, and this letter was addressed to Hans's father. And in this letter, Fritz said that Hans was completely innocent, that all of the stories that he had told in the trial about Hans participating in the murders, they were all made up. But then there was also another letter found, written by Fritz, addressed to the police. And this letter said, quote, "You won't kill me. I'll be back. Yes, I shall be amongst you for all eternity. And now you yourselves have also killed. You should know it. Hans Granz was innocent. Well, How's your conscience now? Twisted mind games. That is what he is playing. Twisted mind games from beyond the grave. Fritz is basically saying that he is laughing at the police because now the police are no better than him, because the police have also killed an innocent person, being Hans Granz. And he's saying that he will now haunt these police officers forever because they are now killers themselves. However, Fritz didn't realize that he would be executed first. And these letters were found before Hans was executed. So now Hans went for a retrial, and Hans Granz was now sentenced to 12 years in prison for being a knowing accomplice and accessory to the murders. And Hans served his sentence, got released, and lived all the way until 1975, where he died of old age. And in the aftermath of this case, Fritz's brain was actually removed after his execution to be studied. And unbelievably, it was kept in a German university to be studied all the way until 2014. So this brain was kept and studied, and it was in storage for like 90 years. And then it was cremated in 2014. And as for Fritz's victims, as many of their remains were recovered as possible, and they were buried together in a communal grave in a cemetery in Hanover, which is still there to this very day. And given the fact that this case happened so long ago, I mean, it did happen like 100 years ago, pretty much exactly, 100 years ago. We don't really know anything about the victims. We pretty much only know their names. But it must have just been such a scary time to live in Hanover when Fritz was on the loose. And my heart just goes out to every single victim. They were killed in the most brutal and sadistic way. And that was the case of Fritz Hamann, the vampire of Hanover / Wolfman / the butcher of Hanover. So as always, let me know your thoughts, theories and opinions. As always, don't forget to leave me your case suggestions in the comments down below, because I always want to know what you want to hear next. Thank you again to Dragon City for sponsoring today's video. Don't forget you can check them out using the link in my description box. And that is everything from me, so I'll see you all in my next video. Bye.